All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Java with Otava. Today, we're going to be speaking about disaster recovery preparedness and some tactics and things that you should be aware of in planning for both continuity of operations and recovery should an incident occur. We're joined today by our panelists. I'm going to allow each of them to introduce themselves quickly. Tatiana, let's start with you, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm just a lawyer, here to talk about lawyer stuff.
JD, over to you, please.
Good morning, Jason Duchnowski. I am a product manager at Otava, and my responsibility is business continuity, disaster recovery, and backup solutions.
All right. Brandon, how about you, sir?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So Brandon McCoy, I am a senior system engineer at Veeam Software, supporting our cloud and service provider team.
Excellent. And my name is Jeremy Bigler. I'm the Director of Product Management here at Otava, and I'll be your moderator for this morning's discussion. So let's dive in. First off, let's talk a little bit about what in fact a disaster is. And when we think of disaster, right, we think of the acts of God and horrific things like hurricanes, fires, floods, things like that, right? But interestingly enough, 52% of 800 survey respondents cited human error as the #1 cause of unplanned downtime. In fact, 62% of failures were actually caused by human error. Out of the organizations that were impacted, 50% of those experienced downtime lasting longer than a full workday. And last but not least, 74% of companies with outages that were in excess of 1 million believe their recent downtime incidents could have been prevented. So this really brings up a critical point that we have to keep in the back of our mind, and that is disasters don't just come from weather or power outages or other incidents outside of our control. In fact, as we see here from Alliance, cyber incidents are the most likely to occur. So we saw in today's environment, for example, the impact that COVID-19 has. In fact, the rapid change in landscape, thanks to the pandemic and remote workforce shifts, et cetera, have actually increased risk exposure for many organizations that put into place short-term methods of connectivity to increase access by a now mobile workforce. Even prior to COVID, though, we did see a rise in cyber incidents in 2020, as well as in concern around legislative changes. Brandon, Tatiana, I'm curious to see if you think that this trend is going to continue post-pandemic and into 21.
Yeah, this is Brandon. I'll start there. Definitely, and unfortunately, I do think that this trend will continue. I do a lot of webinars and study on ransomware, and this is just another thing that kind of folds into the issues here. There's a very interesting study in 2019. I believe ransomware cost was up to 11.5 billion. And that continues at an upward trajectory. So, putting that into the mix with, human error, like you said, acts of God, ransomware, all of the above, does seem to be on a steady incline.
I echo Brandon's comments. There are definitely an increased number of ransomware incidents. There are increased attacks, and bad actors are taking advantage of the distraction that we have right now, and definitely appear to be, as Brandon mentioned, getting a lot of bang for their buck. We've also seen issues across the spectrum in supply chain failure, right? Where now we're looking more and more at throughput in the internet, and now we see how critical that infrastructure is. But that goes directly also to how we use our own suppliers and how we're monitoring their availability and their capacity and the services they can provide. You also asked about whether there'll be continuing development on the regulatory side. Absolutely. That is not slowing down. Actually, this morning, the Office for Civil Rights announced another settlement of about $1 million with a healthcare entity for the organization losing a laptop. So, nope, not slowing down at all.
Got it. Got it. Good perspective. And really, I think we'd all agree with cyber and human-related incidents being, key contributors to disruption. I think this really now focuses our discussion around data privacy and security. So with that said, I'd like to actually get Tatiana, can you walk us through really some of the drivers here behind data privacy and security a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at, there are a number of factors that lead organizations to pay more attention to privacy and security and their compliance with those obligations. So first and foremost, we have all of the laws. Typically, we see these come from state data breach notification laws. As most, hopefully, I think everyone on the phone knows, there aren't really any, there's no federal data breach notification law. We have some federal laws in specific sectors of the economy. So for example, in the healthcare space, we've got HIPAA, which is a federal law. We also have FERPA in the education space, but there's no general data breach notification law that applies to every industry. So for that, we look to what the states require. And so if you're an organization that has locations in, say, California, New York, and Florida, where you're going to have 3 different obligations that you need to meet should there be an incident. Similarly, if you are an organization like Otava, where the company has customers and clients all over the country, they have to be concerned with state data breach notification laws across the entire country, right? Plus the U.S. territories, as well as what's happening globally. So that's one driver. And typically, state data breach notification laws, with some exceptions, require that companies use quote unquote best practices for security. So I leave that up to you to decide what that means. The other big driver of data privacy and security obligations is industry standards. And the most commonly known one is PCI DSS, because just about every single company uses credit cards. We've also increasingly seen customer requirements as a driver, and it's because a lot of customers are operating in regulated spaces. So maybe they're publicly traded and they have to comply with SOX. Maybe they're in the insurance space, or maybe they're a healthcare organization where they have flow down obligations and some requirements to monitor and manage their own vendors. So as part of a customer's vendor compliance program, other third parties may see flow down obligations. And then least but not least, enforcement is a big driver of obligations, because that's what, at least for us lawyers, that's what we look to figure out, okay, when the government says best practices, what does that actually mean? Next slide, please. And so here's just some examples of the kinds of enforcement you could see and the kinds of actors who take enforcement actions. So if you are, let's say, a multi-state hospital system like Cottage Health out of California, and you have a data breach, you might see an action from consumers in the form of a class action. You might see an enforcement action or investigation from the Federal Trade Commission, as well as the Office for Civil Rights. And HHS OCR is the primary federal regulator of HIPAA, which is why they would come into play. You might also see activities from the state attorneys general. And while not listed here in the example for Cottage Health, the California Attorney General did investigate Cottage Health as part of the incident they had. If you're accepting credit cards, you might also see actions and activities from credit unions and banks, because they don't like to lose money, and when they have to cancel credit cards, someone has to pay for that, right? If there was fraud on the credit card systems, again, as part of a merchant account, companies would have agreed to reimburse credit card companies for the losses they sustain, and so forth. And so you can see that one incident can be very costly. And the example I included here, Cottage Health had a data breach in 2013, and they had multiple actions. You can see how long this investigation, right, and all the enforcement action that stemmed from that lasted. So you're looking at some costs here where they had a class action settlement of $4.125 million. Then they had a lawsuit from their insurance company because they were really mad that they had to pay out on that data breach class action. And so they sued Cottage Health to try and recoup those funds. And then they had a settlement with OCR in 2018. So you can see that lasted for many years. Obviously very expensive just in the settlement amounts, but also in the personnel costs, the legal costs, all of the lost productivity that's generated by that. Oh, and to boot, for Cottage Health, this incident was caused by a third-party vendor, right? And who dealt with the cost for that? It wasn't the vendor, it was Cottage Health. The last one I want to note on here is county governments, where we are now increasingly seeing local governments hire plaintiffs' class action firms, the firms that would typically take on litigation for consumers, to sue on behalf of the county to try and recoup losses. So one of the first ones that we saw in this space was Cook County in Illinois, filing a lawsuit or hiring a plaintiff's firm to file a lawsuit against Intel because of the security hole that was in their chips. So, that's an expensive thing for a county to deal with, because now you've got to replace potentially how many servers, right? And they don't have extra costs for that. They don't have extra monies in their budget for that kind of stuff. So if they can use the hammer of a plaintiff's firm to try and get some of those costs covered, why not?
So Tatiana, you brought up a good point there, and that is around third parties, right? Do organizations need to be concerned about data privacy in a third-party scenario, right? I know a lot of us use third-party vendors or sources or providers. Let's talk a little bit about that if we could.
Absolutely. In today's environment, there's no way any company can do business without third parties, right? I think we have learned that during this time of the pandemic, just how important our vendors are and how critical they are to our overall operations. And when we're looking at third parties and we're looking at their contracts, right, it's really important to understand what promises have been made and what they've said about privacy and security and how they handle information. Because again, right, you as a company, you as an organization, you're making certain promises to your customers. And in order for you to live up to your own promises, you have to slow down certain specific obligations to your third-party vendors. And so you could find those obligations in the confidentiality clause, maybe in a separate BAA or a DPA, reps and warranties, what happens to the data on termination, disclaimers, indemnification, and then other certain terms like what you might see in license grants, right? So you want to make sure that you're really understanding what you're allowing your vendors to do, because one, for example, the clause that's included here comes from a real contract, and look at the broad grants, right, where the vendor and its affiliates are granted a perpetual license to use the data, right? That means forever, right? You can't undo that. You can't take that back later. And so oftentimes what we'll see is, and you as an organization may say, you know what, that's fine. We don't care about this. We actually need our vendor to have this because they're doing all kinds of research, analysis, product improvement, benchmarking, all these great things. And these are services that we actually want them to do. At the same time, if they have a perpetual right to do something, what does that mean in terms of your indemnification, right? If the vendor has a data breach, so 10 years after the contract, your data has now been disclosed, right? There's been a breach, someone has to provide notice. Do you as an organization, does that vendor have to now cover you for the cost that you have to incur in dealing with that incident, Now consider again the Cottage Health scenario where the issue was caused by their vendor, but it's Cottage Health who was sued with the class action. It wasn't their vendor. So they're the ones that ended up bearing the brunt of that loss. And you don't want to be in that position. And so you really want to make sure you're looking at what you're allowing your vendor to do, right? And what remedies you have should something go wrong.
So this is an interesting topic, I think, to drive a little bit more into. Tatiana, are there recommendations you have for how organizations can better validate or vet their vendors, and what types of things should they consider when negotiating contracts or agreements with those vendors?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing you really want to do is actually read your contract. I can't tell you how many times I've seen contracts where vendors make, there's a great term that says, hey, we promise we're going to implement all these security controls and protect your information. And then in the disclaimers, they disclaim obligation for security. Well, those two things don't go hand in hand, right? They don't work together. And so you really need to understand what your vendor is promising and what they're willing to do and what they're not. The other thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is organizations take a more robust hand in asking questions about the controls that organizations are using. So they're either doing that through an IT questionnaire, they're doing maybe an annual certification, which we see a lot in the healthcare space with business associate agreements, or they're using, a third-party audit as their gateway for looking at compliance. So like a SOC 2 Type 2, right, where you're sort of deferring some of that assessment to a third-party company who's in the business of doing audits. The one thing I'll say about the audits is you just want to make sure, that those are actually disinterested, right? That they're not like an affiliate of another affiliate where they've got some financial stake in making the company look good. I hate to say that, but unfortunately we see that happening with third-party vendors. So you do want to just, take care. I mean, at the same time, right, this is something that you have to devote some time and money to, right, as an organization. And with limited budgets, you want to, think about how do you sell this internally to your organization, because I know from, the legal standpoint where legal's always a cost, right? Like we don't make money for organizations. At the same time, I think like if you can avoid a $4 million class action lawsuit, I think that's pretty good.
Makes perfect sense. Now I know that in a lot of cases, right, or organizations that we're talking to today, clients, prospects, etc., are also doing their own internal security work, right? Setting up an information security or similar team to try to manage their own risk posture, risk exposure. Are there any resources, since many of the mandates that we've talked about outside of maybe PCI are prescriptive, or not prescriptive rather, but are suggestive in nature, right, versus prescriptive. Are there any resources, Tatiana, that you could help point our attendees to help enable some of those activities?
Yeah, definitely. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of the enforcement actions, because even though you may not be in healthcare, the enforcement actions from the Office for Civil Rights, most of what they talk about is best practices. So for example, encrypt your laptops, right? Make sure all of your laptops are encrypted. That's an easy way to avoid a problem, because if data is encrypted, it pulls you out of breach notification obligations, both at the federal level in the case of HIPAA and under state laws, where it specifically as part of the definitions for what a breach is in these cases, it says if the data is encrypted, then it's not a breach, right? At the same time, that also means that, hey, don't, make sure there's no sticky with a password, right, tied to the laptop, so that if the laptop is stolen, they're not also stealing the credentials. simple things like that. And what I'll do, Jeremy, is I will provide a couple of resources for really good enforcement actions from both OCR and the FTC to provide as a source of what you can use internally as an internal checklist for, are you following best practices? That, and then of course, if anyone has questions, you're welcome to follow up with me afterwards, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. But at the very least, your organization can use those actions as a means of testing against, hey, what do we have internally, and do we have gaps that we can identify? The other source of resources that you can use to figure out whether you've got appropriate data privacy and security controls in place is, what promises does your organization make to its own customers, right? What does your privacy policy say on your website? Has anybody looked at that, right? Because if you are promising that you have the most secure environment ever, I can tell you that that's bad. You don't want to do that, because as good as your controls are, we know that that stuff can be broken. So you just want to make sure that that's in line with what you're doing. So one is to your customers on your website, right, through means of your privacy policy, but also through your whatever master contract agreement that you have your customer sign. What are you promising in that? Is there a sort of a security addendum or any similar document that where it's saying, so here are the controls we have, and what processes are you using internally to actually test those controls?
Excellent. And before we move on, Brandon, I'm curious from a provider standpoint, right, as an ISV serving the global market space, what do you see here from a data privacy and a security? What are some of the things that Veeam is looking into to help better secure, protect, and provide that level of comfort for users out there?
Yeah. So, Veeam being just the software, I always say that we're as good or as bad or as safe or as unsafe as, the hardware you put us on, the hardening of the data center. But even within the product itself, obviously, our encryption methods, we're always trying to stay up to date. Like Tatiana mentioned, as secure as you want to be, there's really no ransomware proof if anything is connected to the internet or online. So you always want to make sure that that you're as secure as can be, that you have multiple copies, like she said, that everything is encrypted. One thing that came to my mind while we were talking is something known as GDPR. So this is General Data Protection Regulation, and it's actually a law in the EU. Veeam being a global company, made some features around that. So it's called the right to be forgotten. And so basically, if a company has a customer's data and then they are no longer servicing that customer, it's their right to their data to be removed from that company's database. And Veeam has options to help you with that. So you can take, for instance, a backup of a bunch of virtual machines, physical machines, whatever, and you can, before you restore that data, remove specific data from that backup file. So that's some things that Veeam is doing in order to help with those kinds of regulations and with privacy, being such an important thing that we see today.
Thank you. So one of the things I think that this leads us now into discussing, right, is the concept of cyber liability, right? I know that recently this has become a sort of a de facto component of any organization's insurance portfolio to ensure that they're protected. But Tatiana, it seems like there's probably some pitfalls here that we should be available of. Can you walk us through some of your recommendations around cyber liability insurance?
Sure. I think the first one is buy as much as you can afford. And it's one of those things where you can never have too much cyber liability insurance so long as it actually covers your business. I can't tell you how many policies I've read where one of the requirements of the policy is that all of your data is encrypted. Well, of course, right? To me, you might as well just burn that policy, because if that's a condition of coverage, meaning that if your data isn't encrypted, you can't use the policy, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, if your data is encrypted, it pulls you out of the data breach notification laws. And so what's the purpose of that policy if it's not actually covering your risk, right? Because what you're actually concerned about is, hey, either someone's laptop wasn't encrypted, someone lost their mobile phone with email on it, all these things. And so you really want to understand what's in that policy. The other thing that's important to look at is that policy actually covering the way you do business? And so, for example, there are policies that say that independent contractors either are not covered, right? Meaning that those independent contractors would then need to have their own insurance, or they're only covered if there are written contracts in place. Well, if your company routinely uses independent contractors, right, and maybe the policies and controls around that are a bit lax, right, where maybe you don't have written agreements in place with everyone, that's going to compromise your coverage. And that's not a position you want to be in because, unfortunately, independent contractors, they're people like everyone else, right? And so they can make a mistake. And if they're doing work for you, right, the chances that they're going to be able to afford to reimburse you for losses is probably on the lower side, right? Just like smaller organizations. Another important thing to think about is I do get a lot of pushback on putting damages caps in contracts where I'll say, okay, well, we're going to be responsible for up to, say, $1 million if there's an incident. And a lot of folks get really concerned about it. They want unlimited liability because, after all, why should they bear the cost of something that was your fault? So it's not an unreasonable position, but we can't buy an unlimited amount of coverage, right? And so you really want to think about, like, what does that mean for your business? You don't want to be in a position where one issue can basically put you out of business. At the same time, right, if you've got vendors who routinely promise that they are going to be responsible for unlimited amounts of damages, okay, great. But then they don't carry any insurance, I guarantee you that that promise is not worth the paper it's written on, right? Because, again, you can't buy an unlimited amount of insurance, and two, they're gonna basically be judgment proof, right? They're not gonna have the money to live up to that unless they're, maybe a publicly traded entity or something along those lines. And so you really want to be careful to make sure that you're not bearing an unreasonable amount of burden because of your vendors, right? Everyone shares the risk and security and privacy, and so that should be a shared responsibility, right? And that you're confirming that they actually have coverage, because if they don't, when push comes to shove, they're not going to have the money to reimburse you for the cost, and you're going to be stuck with those at the end anyway.
That's a good point. In fact, I recall back a number of years ago now, I believe it was one of the large retailers was put in jeopardy by a third-party vendor, right? Which, in the case that you just described, Tatiana, their cyber liability insurance would not have covered that exposure, and it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit coverage.
Yeah, these can get really, really expensive. And again, as you saw from the Cottage Health incident, right, you're looking at a class action. So the class action settlement was $4 million. Well, think about how much it costs to defend that, between the legal fees, expert witness fees, all the travel you might have to do. Those things are really, really expensive to defend. So even if at the end of the day, you spent, you won, let's say you won the class action, you didn't have to pay anything. Well, if you spent $3 million defending that, do you feel like a winner? Probably not.
Now, what if though companies are doing the right things, right? Maybe they're SOC 2 compliant or appropriately compliant with whatever legislation requirements are for their compliant industry. They're doing regular pen testing, they're doing regular security audits. Does that in any way mitigate, or is that almost table stakes for many insurers today?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely mitigates. And one of the things you really want to be careful about is, so when you buy insurance, and this is really important for you IT folks, right? Because someone in your insurance team is probably filling out that application and they don't really understand what's being asked, right? So when you buy insurance, the insurance company gives you this questionnaire that says, hey, what controls do you have in place? Do you have pen testing? Do you have vulnerability scans? Do you have policies and procedures? Do you require that your third-party vendors do the same things? Oh, and by the way, have you ever had a security incident? Well, I think most lay people would say, hey, no, we've never had a security incident because we've never had a situation that we've had to report to a regulator, right? We didn't have to report anything to OCR or State Attorney General, and so we've never had anything. But you tech folks understand that, hey, security incident could really be malware, right? Depending on how you define it. And these insurance questionnaires, they don't define it, right? They just say, have you ever had a security incident? And so if your organization says no to that, like just yesterday, you had 2 malware incidents with someone's email, right? Well, the insurance company can later use that as a way to say, hey, company, you lied to us, you defrauded us, we're going to void your coverage, right? Because you weren't honest with us. And, you know, of course, that always happens right when you need your insurance, right when you actually need coverage. And so you want to make sure that you're understanding what your folks are responding and what they're saying. And so that, and that, again, that the controls you have, right, match what you're doing. And so this is another way for you to say, if your organization is pushing back on costs and they don't want to make the necessary technical investment, right, the necessary investment in technology resources, this is your opportunity to say, hey, remember that insurance application we filled out which said that we do X, Y, Z? If we don't renew these licenses, we need to tell the insurance company because now we're not actually implementing, right? And we don't have the controls that we promised them we would have, and therefore we can jeopardize our coverage.
Good feedback. Thank you. And I think, folks, as we think about, right, some of these concerns, the impact of these concerns are also something to consider as well. Of course, you've probably already heard many of these things, right? But in addition to simply the traditional disasters, right? Think about some of these interesting scenarios. For example, Data Viper, a security services organization, was itself hacked, right? We understand today that service providers are likely one of the biggest target groups because of the amount of organizations that this opens up for potential impact. Impact to trading, impact to financial impact to student records, to health records. The list goes on and on, right? I don't think we have to spend too much time talking about the impact, but these are organizations that I think we could say defensively have a very robust security policy. So one of the key things is not a matter of rolling the dice, but it's really a matter of planning and preparing for the almost inevitability of something occurring, and how does the organization remain unimpacted, or how do you mitigate risk from such a situation occurring? So when we think about impact as well, it's not just dollars and cents. It's also impact to things like brand awareness, market awareness, right? New customer adoption, new customer attraction. I would say that you know, if we think about the impact of disasters, right? 42% of those that experienced a significant business impact, out of that subset, 18% was serious or severe, which means downtimes in days or weeks. So think about what that might do to your organization's brand. I'm curious, panelists, if we have a sense of how long it would take an organization, should they suffer something like that, how long do we think it would take to recover brand awareness or customer confidence, specifically in a scenario like we're in today with COVID?
Yeah, I think it's hard to measure how long that a brand is impacted, realistically. But there have been studies that have been done that show following an incident, how long that brand is actually directly impacted by customers leaving. The residual is really like you're looking at multiple years post incident that there's going to be direct like sales and customer churn situations because of that incident. Now, like the long term, I think that's more subjective, but certainly for what I would call short term is probably more like 2-3 years is where you're going to really see that direct impact. Yeah, and I want to throw one thing out here, just an example. I know we're talking about things like cybersecurity incidents, but it goes well beyond that. Things that really, I think, are difficult for a company to prepare for. I'll give an example. Early on in my career, I was doing implementation work for a sand storage provider. So we were working with a banking institution, and we did a significant infrastructure upgrade. And during that upgrade went flawless. Everything went perfect. We're getting ready to leave, and we were stopped before we left because their customer-facing banking application went down. And the short version of what happened, non-technical, is that the infrastructure was running so well and so high performant that software that was running on that banking application couldn't keep up with the performance and took the server down. They actually had to fail over in the disaster recovery scenario because of that. Thankfully, they had all the mechanisms in place, but it was on a weekend. Clients wouldn't have been able to do any online banking. Like, it was a really big potential impact. So, trying to, I think, quantify what is, if I was a banking institution, just as that example, if I was down for one day, how can I really measure a consumer's perspective of that incident? I think it's really hard to measure, and the ramifications could take a long time to kind of get over, because that stuff sticks in your head, right? I was just sitting here thinking that was maybe like 12 years ago, and just sticks out as like a major incident in my head. Like, wow, it's something that you can't really plan for. Software that just doesn't work correctly in an incident like that. So it definitely goes way beyond cyber security. But I just want to throw that little nugget out there.
No, appreciate that. And really, I think this does translate any disruption, right? Regardless of the source or the cause, any disruption impacts far more than just bottom line. Although all of these, I think, can be traced back to bottom line impact, right? Customer confidence, brand integrity, less customers, less revenue you're generating for the organization, right? Employee confidence, higher churn rate, higher cost to hire and retain. All of those have bottom line impacts. So I think the real question facing us is how do we protect, how do we secure our organization, right? We talked a little bit about compliance and the need to encrypt and the need to secure and the need to ensure that our vendor contracts are appropriately validated, vetted, and reviewed. But from a technology standpoint as well, right? The disaster recovery component of continuity of operations strategy, there's a couple different ways or tactics we can take. If we look at really a tiered approach, right? One of the goals that any organization should have, right, is to avoid two very critical missteps in a disaster recovery strategy. The first is overspending, right? You don't want to protect everything with the top tier solution, because you're probably spending more money than you need to. But the second, which is equally important and probably more severe, is underprotecting, right? And it's critical for us to understand from a business impact analysis or similar continuity planning exercise what our recovery objectives are. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but JD, if you could sort of walk us through the tiers here for protection.
Yeah, happy to. So I think the way, like Jeremy, like you were sharing, the way to look at it is really the tier of importance to the business. So how critical is it to get that application or that data online and available in the event of an incident? So tier one is, the critical data to the business. It's the lifeblood. It's the stuff that I cannot operate. I can't handle client transactions. Applications and data that are tied to that, which there probably are a number of systems that are tied into things like client transactions. But doing near real-time replication, where I'm really looking at the transaction level data and replicating each transaction from one site to another. And I have that visibility on a transaction level or down to the minute and second. And I can say, depending on the situation of what happened, I can roll back to the last good point in time, or just give me the most recent one. That's really what that top tier is, that replication technology that allows me really kind of like that journaled capability, because, in the event that maybe it's a security incident, let's say my security incident happened at 12:01 specifically, but now it's 4 o'clock, maybe I need to roll back. I need to go back to noon because that's my last good known state. So, having technology that can not only be that near zero RPO, but allows me to kind of have that flexibility of when I recover and bring that data up very quickly, regardless of kind of which point in time that I pick. So that's kind of top tier, right? Is having that flexibility of recovery, and also being able to recover very quickly. Middle tier is business important. These are kind of supporting systems of that top tier, but aren't critical for, maybe not money generating applications, but maybe I have teams of people that rely on these systems to do their jobs. RPO and RTO are less critical here. And the cost curve when you get down to tier two is exponentially less than tier one. So as we continue to kind of work down the tiers, exponential cost reduction. So tier two, point in time, it's not that journaled capability, but it's a point in time. So I have the ability to say, okay, what did my application look like at a specific point? And I take a snapshot, it's consistent. So I know it will recover when I go back to pick that point in time. I don't have to do, a crash recovery. It is a good known state. And it's used to back up typically larger sets of data. I have virtual machines, I have maybe file systems, things like that. And now the mechanism to recover that data is I can either potentially bring that up near instantaneous, it depends on the technology, or I may have to rely on physics to move that data off of whatever that system is to recover the application. So it's kind of business important, right? So we're talking about hours potentially, depending on the mechanism of recovery. If we're talking about just, applying, an instant recovery situation, Veeam has that capability rolled into it where you can do that instant recovery, or maybe I need to recover off of data. Data-centric is, as the name suggests, it's all about data. We're talking about larger volumes of data. Maybe this is where I have a longer retention period. So instead of, my tier one, where maybe I just have a couple days worth of points in time, my data-centric is longer term archive. I have, potentially years worth of data that I can reference and recover files or virtual machines, or, sunsetting an application. I may just say, hey, I'm going to back you up, and then I'm just going to retain you in an archive kind of a situation. So very low cost, but, this helps me be compliant with different regulations. Depending on what industry you're in, may have that 7-year or 3-year, 1-year retention. I think it's important to have that capability where I can hold the long, large volumes of data for a long period of time.
Makes sense. And Brandon, from a provider perspective, again, in your experience working with end users and providers, where do we see the majority of application workloads falling in sort of this pyramid of DR?
Yeah, so I would say in between tier one and tier two, and a lot of times both of those are necessary, right? Just like Jason was mentioning, your RTO, when I hear RTO, I think more of the disaster recovery, right? I'm more worried about how quickly I can recover, and especially in a disaster scenario. There are a lot of times where, words like disaster recovery, kind of gets thrown around like as a buzzword, but when you really think about, okay, your whole data center's down, your Active Directory is not replicated, all of your DNS records and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that you really need to plan for. And so, having that recovery plan in place and then not having to worry about any of that. Like right with Veeam and replication, Cloud Connect replication in specific, a customer can literally flip a switch and their whole data center is now up and running, at the service provider's location. They don't have to worry about any kind of manual intervention. And then the tier two, like we were mentioning, not all the machines matter as much in terms of, if it takes, 4-6 hours to restore, that's okay. I don't want to have to pay for the overhead of always having a replicated machine ready to go. I just need to be able to recover this data within a reasonable amount of time. There may be some manual intervention, right? My service provider can still intervene and take those backups and restore in their data center, but there's just more moving parts. But yeah, I think tier one and tier two are where we really see the most, customers using service providers in Veeam.
Got it. Got it. Now I know Otava, for example, is we eat our own dog food, right? We have an entire data center replication strategy that has rollback points and recovery points specifically for ransomware and other malware attacks, in addition to simply just continuity. But what are some of the services, JD, if you could walk us through that we can offer our partners in this solution?
Yeah, if we want to kind of peel back that top layer and say, what are the technologies that are driving these different tiers of solutions? Brandon was alluding to a couple of them. From an Otava perspective, our tier one disaster recovery solution is a Zerto-powered solution. It does that journaling that I was mentioning. Very short RPO. We're talking about near real-time replication and recovery. So it uses that run book and a feature set where I can tell it what applications come up in what order, which applications need to be grouped together because they all communicate together. It's a very orchestrated failover solution that is customizable, but it is simple enough that we have a number of folks that use it for that full site recovery. So it's a nice, fully capable solution that's been out for a long time. We have a number of solutions that fit into that tier two, kind of depending on where your data lives. We have public cloud solutions powered by Veeam that are part of that Otava Cloud Backup portfolio. We're backing up Office 365, Microsoft 365 data into our cloud, simple SaaS-based kind of offering there. But then we can also back up cloud, just traditional cloud workloads, virtual machines, on-prem. So if you're not inside of the Otava cloud, we have the ability to capture that data, bring it into our data repository. That's using that Cloud Connect technology that Brandon was alluding to. So what we're really doing there is we're building out a full suite of cloud backup solutions so that that business important data that can be recovered in minutes to hours kind of a scenario, regardless of kind of where it lives or what type of data it is, that offering can protect the data there. And then for kind of that big, I have a lot of data, I maybe have a long-term retention, the Otava Cloud Backup can suit that. But if we want to get into really cheap and deep stuff, Otava S3 storage is a great offering there. Super cost effective, highly scalable. So, we're talking about tens and hundreds of terabytes worth of data that can be dumped out to an S3 platform. at a very, very low cost. So being cost conscious there, but we're hitting a lot of check boxes from a compliancy standpoint. Hey, I need to hold on to this data for a long period of time, or I don't know when I'm going to have to reference this. That's a great solution for that. It's just going to take a little bit longer time to recover, but in general, I think the number of instances you're probably going to reach out to recover that data is going to be really, infrequent. So that's a quick picture of our continuity strategy. And, I think it's really, I just kind of want to add one more thing from the earlier conversation is, I came from the sales side of the house, and I think it's really interesting to understand the types of questions and the pieces that people are interested in when they're talking to a provider. It generally does lead towards what is the technology, what's the outcome, but hopefully what some folks are getting out of this conversation is there's more to it on the business side that people need to be really cognizant of. What is the underlying sort of, can this provider cover me from a cyber liability standpoint? Do they have BAAs in place? What is their compliance stance? And really make sure that you're vetting the vendors. So, underneath all of this, the solutions that you may see from lots of other vendors, underlying that is, a provider that's truly, doing the right things and fully capable from a compliance and protecting you and your business. So in the event that you do need to recover, you're also covered from, a liability standpoint. That's what's not really shown on here.
Got it. So one of the things that I do want to cover here, right, is we've been talking about disaster recovery, and disaster recovery is a piece of overall continuity of operations. There's other things that obviously we want to think about holistically when we talk about continuity planning. How will my employees, partners, or vendors connect securely into my environment, right? What happens when a facility is unavailable in the event of a pandemic such as this, right, where we have a lot of remote workforce or similar, right? What happens if remote becomes now the new normal? How do I securely, and the key word here is secure, because again, during a DR incident, right, we see that risk posture historically rises in an organization. They are more exposed to risk because you're putting into place ad hoc solutions to quickly recover services and your business operations. And those security or those solutions may not have the underlying security and controls that your traditional day-to-day business operations do. So keep in mind as you're planning for your continuity plan holistically, that you make sure that security is incorporated as a core component in that. We'd love to speak to you more about a holistic security strategy, so look forward to continuing the conversation beyond a day. I do want to wrap up quickly on a couple things. JD, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the things that we can help offer some of our attendees.
Just talking on mute there. Just wanted to share, all the folks that are joining the webinar, wanted to make you guys aware of our free trials that are available for a number of the solutions that I was referring to a couple slides ago. Protection for Microsoft 365, hitting some highlights. I don't want to read through all the bullets there, but do have a 30-day free trial. Get your feet wet, see how the solution works for you. We want to interact with you during that process. Really simple, straightforward solutions. We just rolled out the 365 a couple months ago and had a lot of success with that so far. So we have a link here on the presentation for signing up for that that free trial. It can apply to disaster recovery as a service, Cloud Connect, our cloud backup solution, and also 365 backup. So some nice offerings there to help get your feet wet and get introduced to these services.
Fantastic. And everyone, as a note, will be getting a copy of this presentation following our discussion this morning. Do want to wrap it real quick for those of you who don't know about Otava. First and foremost, we are a secure hosting provider. We offer both cloud services as well as co-location services and a number of solutions that wrap around those services to allow you to bring a true IT as a service experience to your organization. With that said, I am going to wrap today's discussion. We do have a couple questions I want to get to. Our first question that I have here, Tatiana, this is probably to you, will an insurance carrier define an incident, right? So if a question is asked, how would you answer the question as asked, or would you allow someone to claim they tried the best answer to that question as asked, right? How do we sort of respond in best practice to these questionnaires that a vendor will provide?
Great question. So the underwriter will provide more information if you ask them for what they mean by an incident. Generally, though, you could always say something along the lines of, like every organization, we've had incidents with malware and similar types of issues, and we're happy to answer any additional questions the carrier might have, right? Because you should always, with your insurance company, particularly at this early stage, err on the side of over-disclosure rather than under-disclosure. This is not a beauty contest, right? They know what's going on with companies. They're the ones paying out the claims. So it behooves you to be as honest as possible at this stage because, right, I mean, the issue you want to avoid is what happened to Cottage Health where the insurance company said, hey, actually, you lied to us, right? Because they weren't necessarily maybe as forthcoming as they should have been with their questionnaire, right? Just tell the carrier the truth. If it turns out, hey, their pricing proposal is more than what you want, it's a competitive marketplace, ask your broker to look at other carriers.
Got it. The next question we have, and this is an issue that Otava deals with, right, is you have a good security policy in place and process. There is a focus on cybersecurity, but one of the most commonly overlooked assets is the actual devices themselves, right? Be it patches, be it upgrades, be it similar hot fixes that can introduce vulnerabilities or similar. From Otava's standpoint, we actually have taken that into consideration through automating our back-end deployment and management services, where those updates, those patches, those fixes are rolled out to our service infrastructure on an automated basis and done so after appropriate QA validation and vetting so that we're not missing or overlooking anything. But I'm curious, panelists, are there other recommendations or thoughts here that we could provide for value on how organizations can handle that aspect of the business?
We'll probably defer to Tatiana for that one.
There's always controls you can put in place. The way that you should look at controls generally, at least from the legal perspective, is if you didn't document it, you didn't do it, right? And so part of putting this in place is showing your work, as your math teacher used to say, right? What did you put in place? What did you think about? What risk were you trying to control, right? No one is expecting perfection. It is just not possible, right? But it also means that you're paying attention to what's happening in the market. You're looking at where your actual risks are, and you're putting in controls, right? Saying, hey, this was too expensive to implement will never be a good answer to a regulator or in response to a consumer class action. That will not carry the day for you.
Makes sense, and that's good advice, right? Document everything, including SOPs and or standard operating procedures and method of operations for not only your day-to-day activities, but also your service and support operations as well. We did have a follow-up question around liabilities, right? We've taken the question is we've taken appropriate security posture, right? We've done everything we think we could have done, but we're still hacked, right? Do we face less liability than we would if we didn't, right? Where do we see that in the sliding scale, I guess, of exposure?
Absolutely. So you do have less liability, and I think the best source that I can give you for evidence of that is, again, I'm going to turn to healthcare because that's where we see the majority of enforcement. So it's not that it's the only industry that matters, it's just the one that routinely fines people, okay? So we just use it as a good source as a proxy for other things. But we've had thousands and thousands and thousands of organizations report data breaches to the Office for Civil Rights. You can actually go online and we generally call it the wall of shame, where all these organizations are listed, because if your incident impacts 500 or more patients, you have to publicly report, and it's publicly available information. And so there have been thousands and thousands of organizations that have reported that they've had problems, but only about, I want to say less than 100 that have actually entered into settlement. That doesn't mean that, you know, these other organizations weren't investigated, but I mean, security problems happen regardless of how much money you spend and everything you put in place. Problems happen. I mean, we have multiple situations where, we hear of security vulnerabilities that have existed in an operating system for a decade that only now someone has discovered it, right? Or at least that discovery has only now been made public. Right, I mean, these things, like, the code is as good as the designers, right? And people are not perfect. We make mistakes when we develop code, and it just happens. But what you want to do is make sure that you're taking appropriate controls. And the other thing I'll add along these lines is there's an annual report that's done by the Panelists Institute on the cost of a data breach. And 4 of the top things in that report of things you can do, you as an organization can do to decrease the cost of what a data breach will lead your organization to incur are formation of an incident response team, extensive use of encryption, extensive test of an incident response plan, and business continuity management. All of those 4 things we've talked about today with what Otava and Veeam are providing, right? We're talking about, is the data encrypted? Part of all this planning is us talking about, this is an incident response program, right? So you're already doing things to decrease that cost and lead to those savings.
All right. Thank you, team, and thank you to our attendees. I want to thank you for your time today. We appreciate you joining us for this session of Java with Otava. You all will be provided with a copy of this deck, and I would encourage you to continue the conversation. There's a wealth of resources that Tatiana and JD and Brandon have mentioned, and we'd like to continue that with you following today's event. Appreciate your time today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.